What if I told you Hollywood studios torched over $100 million on movies fewer people watched than live in a small town? Somewhere, a producer signed off on a budget bigger than most countries' GDP for a film that earned less than your monthly rent. These aren't obscure student projects. These are real releases, real stars, real catastrophes, and one of them made exactly $30. 30. Stick around, because by the end of this list, you'll question how any of these ever got greenlit at all. Number 19. Sarah Landon and the Paranormal Hour, 2007. A wide theatrical release that almost nobody attended. Sarah Landon and the Paranormal Hour pulled in $858,415. A number that sounds almost respectable until you realize this film actually opened in real theaters, competing for real screens against real competition, and lost spectacularly. It's a horror flick built around supernatural mystery, the kind of premise that usually finds at least a cult following. Instead, it found empty auditoriums. What makes this entry sting is the distribution itself. Studios don't usually waste wide releases on films destined to vanish without a trace. Someone believed in this. Someone pushed for theaters, for marketing, for a real shot, and the audience simply didn't show up. It's a reminder that a wide release is not a guarantee of survival. Sometimes it's just a louder way to fail. Sarah Landon haunts box office lists now more than it ever haunted moviegoers. Number 18. Until the End of the World, 1991. Wim Wenders' sprawling sci-fi road movie, Until the End of the World, earned $835,810 against a famously massive budget, reportedly one of the most expensive independent productions of its era. This was supposed to be cinema's first true global road trip, filmed across multiple continents with an ambitious vision of technology, memory, and apocalypse. Critics respected the ambition. Audiences mostly stayed home. It's more art house experiment than mainstream disaster, which makes its inclusion here slightly controversial. But strictly by the numbers, it qualifies completely. The film has since become a cult favorite, reissued in extended director's cuts that fans treat almost reverently. Yet none of that retroactive love changes what happened in theaters. A movie engineered for greatness that quietly collapsed under its own scale. Sometimes the most expensive failures aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the ones critics still defend decades later, while the ledger tells an entirely different story. Number 17. Texas Rangers, 2001. Texas Rangers cost roughly $38 million to make and returned just $763,740. Let that gap sink in. This was a Western, with a stacked young cast, period production design, horses, gunfights, the whole genre playbook, and it still couldn't crack $1 million domestically. Westerns are notoriously risky bets, but even by that genre's brutal standards, this result is staggering. The film sat on a studio shelf for roughly 2 years before release, a classic warning sign that executives themselves had lost faith. By the time it finally hit theaters, the marketing push was minimal, the buzz non-existent, and audiences had already moved on to other things entirely. It's the kind of flop that doesn't just lose money. It erases confidence in an entire genre for years afterward. Texas Rangers didn't just fail. It became a cautionary case study studios still quietly reference when pitching anything resembling a period Western today. Number 16. Delgo, 2008. Delgo cost an estimated $40 million to animate and ultimately holds one of the worst opening weekends in wide-release history, finishing with under $1 million total. This wasn't some unknown indie animation. It featured a genuinely star-studded voice cast and years of production work behind it. And yet, on opening weekend, it earned roughly $500 per theater on average, a number so low it became infamous in industry circles almost instantly. Animation is one of the most expensive genres to produce, which makes a failure this total almost unbelievable. $40 million, multiple recognizable names attached, a wide theatrical push, and audiences essentially ignored its existence entirely. It remains one of the textbook examples cited whenever people discuss catastrophic box office collapses, not because it's the cheapest film on this list, but because the gap between investment and return is almost mathematically absurd. Delgo didn't just bomb, it detonated. Number 15. Fever Pitch, 2005. Fever Pitch earned $618,847, a brutal number for a film with recognizable stars and a mainstream romantic comedy sports premise that should have, on paper, performed reasonably well. This is an older Hollywood bomb in the truest sense. A film with real studio backing, a release date positioned for relevance, and a genre formula audiences had embraced countless times before. None of that mattered. The film simply failed to connect, vanishing from screens almost as quickly as it arrived. What makes entries like this so fascinating is how unremarkable the failure looks from the outside. There's no scandal, no infamous production disaster, no viral meme attached to it. It's just a film that quietly, almost politely, underperformed into oblivion. Sometimes the box office doesn't punish ambition or excess. Sometimes it punishes nothing at all, and a perfectly competent film simply gets ignored by an audience that had somewhere else to be that weekend. Number 14. Creature, 2011. Creature opened in over 1,500 theaters, a genuinely wide release by any studio's standard, and still managed to finish with only $533,235. Think about that scale for a moment. 1,500 screens means thousands of showtimes, millions of advertising impressions, a marketing budget built around the assumption that people would actually show up. They didn't. This swamp monster horror film became something of an industry punchline almost immediately, cited as proof that theater count means absolutely nothing if the product itself can't generate word of mouth. Critics tore it apart before release even finished its first weekend, and audiences who did wander in left reviews so scathing they effectively killed any chance of a second weekend recovery. What's remarkable is the math. Divided across 1,500 theaters, this film likely made less than $400 per screen on average, a number usually reserved for art house films playing in a single city, not nationwide horror releases backed by real studio money. Creature wasn't just bad, it was a wide-release failure, so complete that distribution executives still use it internally as a benchmark for what happens when marketing outpaces quality by an impossible margin. Few films demonstrate the gap between studio confidence and audience reality this starkly. Number 13. London Fields, 2018. London Fields starred a genuinely recognizable ensemble cast and carried a literary pedigree, adapted from Martin Amis's acclaimed novel, and still collapsed to $487,420 at the box office. This wasn't a quiet festival release that crept into a few art house screens. This was a wide-ish release, backed by real distribution muscle, built around star power that should have guaranteed at least curiosity-driven ticket sales. Instead, the film became infamous for off-screen drama, almost as dramatic as anything in its plot. Lawsuits between the cast and producers over the final cut, allegations about creative control, and a production saga that overshadowed the actual movie entirely. By the time it finally reached theaters, audiences had already absorbed years of bad press about the project itself. The result was a near-total box office collapse, a film essentially DOA before a single ticket sold. London Fields stands as a brutal case study in how off-screen chaos can poison a release long before opening weekend even arrives, proving that star power and literary credibility mean nothing if the public conversation around your film has already turned toxic months in advance. Number 12. Transylmania, 2009. Transylmania, a teen horror comedy spoof, earned just $408,229, despite a genuine wide theatrical release. This was a film built explicitly to chase a young audience. Broad jokes, recognizable spoof formula, a release strategy clearly designed around opening weekend impulse buys from teenagers. The strategy failed almost immediately. Critics didn't just dislike it. Reviews were near universally savage, with some calling it among the worst studio comedies of its decade. Word spread fast, and what should have been a modest opening turned into an instant collapse by the second weekend. Spoof comedies were already a declining genre by this point, oversaturated after years of diminishing returns from similar films, and Transylmania became something of a final nail, proof that audiences had simply exhausted their patience for the format entirely. Few films illustrate genre fatigue this clearly. It wasn't necessarily worse than its predecessors, but it arrived at exactly the moment audiences collectively decided they were done, turning a routine theatrical release into one of the most forgettable wide-release failures of its entire year. Number 11. Southland Tales. 2006. Southland Tales boasted one of the most stacked, eclectic casts on this entire list, and still finished with only $374,755 domestically. This is a film that became a genuine cult phenomenon almost the moment it bombed. A sprawling, surreal apocalyptic satire that critics at its Cannes premiere reportedly booed, only for audiences years later to rediscover it as a strange, prophetic piece of work. That gap between initial reception and long-term reputation makes it one of the most fascinating entries here. At the time, though, none of that future reappraisal mattered. The film was savaged, the theatrical cut was drastically different from the version shown at festivals, and confused audiences simply stayed away in droves. Under $1 million for a film with this much recognizable talent attached is almost unheard of, and it cemented director Richard Kelly's reputation as someone whose ambition consistently outpaced what mainstream audiences were willing to follow. Southland Tales remains proof that critical disaster and cult immortality aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes the box office bomb of one decade becomes the secretly beloved artifact of the next. Number 10. Revolution, 1985. Revolution starred one of the most respected actors in film history in a sprawling historical war epic, and still collapsed to $358,574, a failure so severe it reportedly drove its lead actor away from film acting entirely for several years afterward. This wasn't a small production. It involved extensive period costuming, large-scale battle sequences, and a budget reflecting genuine studio confidence in prestige historical drama. None of it translated into audience interest. Critics were merciless, mocking everything from the accents to the pacing, and the film became something of a punchline almost instantly within industry circles. What makes Revolution particularly haunting on this list is the personal toll it took. Reports suggest the experience was so demoralizing for its star that he retreated from cinema almost entirely, returning to stage work for years before attempting film again. Few box office failures carry this kind of human consequence attached to the financial one. Revolution wasn't just a flop. It became a cautionary tale about how badly a single failed prestige project can derail even the most respected career, proving that box office numbers sometimes measure far more than just money. Number 9. United Passions, 2014. United Passions is one of the strangest box office disasters ever attached to a real global institution. The film was designed as a biographical drama about FIFA and the history of football's governing body, but it earned only $171,511 against a reported budget of more than $25 million. That number would be embarrassing for almost any production, but for a film backed by the organization it was praising, the failure felt even more brutal. United Passions did not collapse because audiences missed the message. They understood the message perfectly, and many seemed to reject it. The movie arrived at the worst possible cultural moment, when FIFA's public image was already being damaged by corruption scandals, investigations, and global criticism. Instead of feeling inspiring, the film came across to many viewers as a tone-deaf vanity project, a polished celebration of an institution people were actively questioning. Critics mocked it mercilessly, calling it stiff, self-important, and disconnected from reality. Audiences barely showed up, turning the film into an instant punchline across sports and entertainment media. What makes United Passions so fascinating is the gap between intention and reception. It wanted to present FIFA as heroic and visionary, but its release timing made that almost impossible. Few box office bombs reveal institutional arrogance this clearly. United Passions was not just ignored, it became a symbol of how badly a powerful organization can misread the public mood. That failure remains astonishing today. It still feels unbelievable for modern film historians worldwide. Number 8. The Hebrew Hammer, 2003. The Hebrew Hammer earned just $96,240 at the box office, a shockingly low total for a film that had genuine cult comedy potential and a premise that should have at least attracted a loyal niche audience. The movie was a satirical take on blaxploitation films, following a tough-talking Jewish superhero forced to save Hanukkah from an evil Santa Claus. On paper, that kind of absurd, boundary-pushing comedy finds its audience on home video or midnight screens. In theaters, it barely registered at all. The release was extremely limited, but even for a small independent comedy, the gross was microscopic. Critics were divided, with some appreciating the sheer audacity of the concept, while others found the joke too thin to sustain a feature-length runtime. The film lacked the marketing muscle to reach beyond its immediate circle, and general audiences simply had no idea it existed. The Hebrew Hammer didn't just fail to find mainstream success, it failed to find almost any commercial footprint whatsoever. Today, it survives as a quirky cult item, but its theatrical run remains a textbook example of a high-concept comedy that arrived with almost zero audience awareness and vanished almost instantly. Number 7. The Starving Games, 2013. The Starving Games earned just $668,802, a brutal collapse for a spoof film arriving from the same creative team behind previous commercially successful parody movies. This was supposed to be a sharp satire of the Hunger Games and other pop culture phenomena of the early 2010s, riding a formula that had made studios money before. Instead, it hit a wall of total audience indifference. By 2013, the spoof genre was already on life support, and The Starving Games became the latest nail in the coffin. Critics tore into it for being lazy, unfunny, and painfully dated almost the moment it was released. There were no clever visual gags or sharp writing to justify the existence of the film. Just a tired string of references masquerading as jokes. Audiences had seen this exact formula executed too many times, and they simply stopped showing up. The Starving Games didn't just underperform, it demonstrated that the era of cheap, reference-heavy spoof comedies was officially dead, marking a spectacular financial low point for a genre that had dominated box offices just a few years prior. Number 6. Food Fight. 2012 Food Fight is one of the most infamous animated failures of the modern era, and its box office total only tells part of the disaster. The film earned just $120,141 after reportedly spending tens of millions of dollars and surviving years of chaotic production problems. On paper, it sounded like a colorful commercial concept. Supermarket mascots come to life after closing time, voiced by recognizable Hollywood names. In execution, it became a nightmare. The project reportedly suffered major delays, technical problems, legal disputes, and a notorious loss of animation work that forced the team to rebuild large portions of the movie. By the time it finally reached audiences, the animation looked shockingly unfinished for a film associated with such a large reported budget. Critics pounced immediately, mocking the visuals, story, humor, and overall quality. Instead of becoming a family-friendly adventure, Food Fight became a warning sign for the animation industry. Its long development cycle did not create polish, it created confusion, compromise, and visible damage on the screen. Audiences stayed away, and the film's tiny theatrical gross became almost secondary to its growing reputation online as one of the worst animated movies ever released. What makes Food Fight so memorable is not just that it failed, but that every stage of its journey seemed to compound the failure. The film became cultural shorthand for production mismanagement, proving that a big idea and famous voices mean nothing if the finished product looks broken beyond repair. Its legacy only grew worse permanently. Number 5. A Troll in Central Park. 1994. A Troll in Central Park is a surprising animated box office failure of its decade because it came from Don Bluth, a filmmaker with real credibility in feature animation. Bluth had previously made beloved animated films that challenged Disney's dominance, so this was not an unknown studio quietly releasing a forgotten cartoon. Expectations were higher, which makes the final box office total even more shocking. A Troll in Central Park earned only $71,368, a disastrous result for a theatrical animated feature. The film told a gentle fantasy story about a flower-loving troll named Stanley, but that softness became part of the problem. At a time when family audiences had more polished and heavily promoted options, the movie struggled to define itself. Its tone felt overly sweet to some viewers, while critics complained about weak storytelling, thin characters, and uneven pacing. Marketing also failed to create the kind of excitement needed to pull families into theaters. Animation depends heavily on clear identity. Parents need to know why this is the movie worth choosing for their children. A Troll in Central Park never gave them a strong enough reason. The result was a quick theatrical disappearance, and one of Bluth's most painful commercial disappointments. Over time, some viewers have remembered it with childhood nostalgia, but nostalgia came much later. In theaters, the movie was almost invisible, proving that even a respected animation name cannot survive poor timing, weak buzz, and a story audiences do not feel compelled to see. Number 4. It's Pat, 1994. It's Pat, released in 1994, remains one of the most infamous examples of a Saturday Night Live sketch failing miserably as a feature film. The movie earned only $60,822 at the box office, a number so tiny that it became part of its own legend. On television, the character worked as a short, awkward joke, built around confusion, discomfort, and repetition. But what could survive for a few minutes on a sketch show completely collapsed when stretched into a full-length movie. Audiences quickly realized there was not enough story, emotional depth, or comic variety to justify the runtime. Critics were extremely harsh, pointing out that the film leaned on the same central gag again and again, without developing anything meaningful around it. Reports of poor test screenings only added to the sense that the studio had little confidence in the finished product. By the time it reached theaters, the release felt almost abandoned. Its box office failure was immediate, not gradual, and it became a warning sign for Hollywood whenever executives tried to turn a thin sketch idea into a movie. It's Pat is still remembered, not because it was a hidden gem, but because its failure was so complete. It proved that a character who might amuse viewers in brief television appearances can become exhausting when forced to carry an entire theatrical film. Number 3. Playback, 2012. Playback is one of those horror thrillers that disappeared so quietly that many moviegoers never even knew it had reached theaters. The film earned only $57,587, an astonishingly low total for a project that had a recognizable name attached. With Christian Slater involved, there was at least some chance of curiosity from genre fans. But that curiosity never turned into real ticket sales. The biggest problem was visibility. Playback arrived with almost no meaningful marketing campaign, limited theatrical presence, and very little conversation around it. For a horror film, that kind of silence can be fatal. The genre depends on buzz, posters, trailers, online chatter, and word-of-mouth excitement, especially when the story is not attached to a major franchise. The plot, centered on disturbing footage, buried secrets, and supernatural revenge, also suffered from arriving at a time when similar ideas had already been used many times before. Critics who noticed the film were not impressed, often describing it as confusing, derivative, or forgettable. Audiences simply had too many other choices, and Playback offered little reason to stand out. Its failure shows that a familiar actor alone cannot rescue a movie when the release strategy is weak. Horror fans are loyal, but they still need to know a film exists. Playback never got that chance, and its theatrical run vanished almost as soon as it began. Number 2. Passion Play, 2010. Passion Play is a strange and fascinating box office failure because it had the kind of cast that should have attracted attention. With Mickey Rourke, Megan Fox, and Bill Murray involved, the film seemed impossible to ignore on paper. Yet it earned only $25,603, making it one of the quietest, star-driven flops of its era. The movie blended romance, crime, fantasy, and magical realism, telling a surreal story about a musician, a mysterious winged woman, and dangerous men circling around them. That unusual premise might have worked as a cult curiosity, but it proved difficult to market to mainstream audiences. Was it a romance? A thriller? A fantasy drama? The film never clearly answered that question in a way that could sell tickets. Critics were divided, though many found the story awkward, confusing, or too self-serious for its own good. Even worse, the theatrical release was extremely limited, with little promotion and almost no public awareness. For a film with recognizable stars, its arrival felt strangely invisible. Passion Play proves that famous names do not automatically create box office safety. Without a clear hook, strong reviews, or a real release campaign, even a movie packed with familiar faces can vanish overnight. Today, it survives mostly as a reminder that star power means very little when audiences are never convinced to show up. Number 1. The Hottie and the Naughty, 2008. At number 1, we have a film that turned a household name into one of the most catastrophic box office figures in modern history. The Hottie and the Naughty. This film earned only $27,288 during its entire domestic theatrical run, a number so staggeringly low it defies belief for a movie starring one of the most famous pop culture figures of the 21st century. The premise was a shallow romantic comedy built entirely around Paris Hilton's brand at the peak of her reality television fame. The studio seemingly assumed her notoriety would automatically translate into ticket sales. They were wrong. Audiences rejected the film so completely that it became an instant laughingstock, playing in mostly empty theaters and earning an average of less than $100 per screen on opening weekend. Critics universally declared it one of the worst films of the decade, but the real story here is the math. $27,000 doesn't just mean the movie bombed, it means the public actively avoided it on a historic scale. Other films on this list failed due to bad marketing, limited releases, or confusing premises. The Hottie and the Naughty had fame, wide screens, and a simple pitch, and it still made less than a used car. It is the ultimate proof that celebrity name recognition is absolutely worthless when the audience has zero interest in watching what you are selling. 19 films. Hundreds of millions burned. One movie that made less than a fast food meal. Hollywood loves to talk about its hits, but the failures tell the real story of risk, ego, and chaos behind the curtain. Which of these shocked you most? Drop it below, because somewhere out there, an even crazier flop is still waiting to be uncovered.